as it is on this stage with two fabulous musicians. So let's hear it, ladies and gentlemen, for that sparkly little diamond on the piano here, Andrew Austin.
And of course, bringing these stories to life with her mad vocal skills, ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Carlin. Hello, Lisa.
Hello, Tom.
So, Lisa Carlin, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, perhaps, Lisa, this audience needs to be warmed up a little bit, you know? Maybe you can, I don't know, do a little audience participation.
Yes.
Right now, just to warm them up.
Absolutely, Tom. Okay, Joe's Pub, repeat after me.
Boo!
Oh, lovely, scared me deep down in my core. Now let's go spookier, scarier. Give me a range. Boo! Oh, the chill bumps don't lie. Thank you so much for playing along.
I'm
terrified.
not sure that I am comfortable with the audience booing at us so early in the show, actually.
They're not booing Greg. They're saying Bowery, which of course is Dutch for farm.
Right, now,
you know that.
Speaking of, as some of you know, Tom and I produced a mini-series this summer in the Netherlands, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but we came back with one particular culinary addiction, I must say.
Pickled herring sandwiches?
They weren't bad, but what I am referring to are those magical little fried spheres of mushy meat deliciousness called, anyone know? Bitterballen.
Oh, yeah.
Bitterballen, yes.
Any Bitterballen fans with us tonight?
Yeah.
I knew there'd be somebody.
We've got to have some
They're
Bitterballen.
good.
They're really
weird,
good.
yeah.
Yeah, there's something between a donut and a meatball. They're delicious. Yeah. In fact, turns out the Dutch brought them with them to New Amsterdam 400 years ago. The first
All right, Tom,
reference I could find.
Tom, no time for Bitterballen banter tonight. We'll save that for later. But we did have a plate backstage in the dressing room, actually.
Yeah, unfortunately, they were so hot we couldn't even touch them. But we will be bringing them out later in the show.
Yes.
Promise.
Now, before we move on, of course, we need to introduce our macabre menagerie. Some of you, people you may love, beings you may know and love. Sheryl Crow.
Right here, there's Cheryl.
Bat Damon.
Bat Damon is around.
Bat Damon's over there.
Damon.
Oh,
And Liza Spinelli is somewhere.
Oh, yes.
Creepy.
Creepy.
Oh, okay.
we never know where she's going to be.
And of course, new to the crew from last year is Bark Twain.
Ooh,
Yes,
Bark
there's
Twain
Bark
is
right
nice.
there. What's that, Bark? You want to hear a ghost story?
Who here wants to hear a ghost story? Ready? Are we ready? It's Halloween, because this is what we're going to do.
Well, I'm going to take us back to the 1670s and out to Staten Island, which was called Richmond at the time, to visit one of the city's oldest and loveliest cities. Houses. It is a picturesque stone manor that sits in a wooded park overlooking the water. And it was here in this house that a historic meeting took place at the very beginning of the American Revolution, and where, according to legend, a patriotic young woman gave her life to the American cause. So many people have lived and worked in this house, and it seems that some have never left and are still knocking about centuries later. For this is the tale of A Spirit Sings at the Conference House.
Spooky. Ooh.
Okay, all right. Setting the table here. So the 1670s, just after the handover of New Netherland to the British in 1664.
That's right. Just a few years after the English took control, a British captain named Christopher Billop was granted more than 1,600 acres of land on Staten Island. And that spot on the island's southern shore became known as Billop's Point and was surrounded by lovely orchards and farmland. And on it, he constructed this handsome stone manor house with an elegant dining room, parlor and fireplace, spacious bedrooms, and servants' quarters.
So good, solid 17th century living.
Yes.
But if we were to flash forward 100 years later, then, around the time of the Revolution, who was living here?
Well, by then the house was owned by Billup's great-grandson, Colonel Christopher Billup. He was known as the Tory Colonel because he was loyal to the crown during the Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
I
loving
don't
this
need
audience.
to remind you, it sounds like, but New York and Richmond, Staten Island, were held by the English then. And, well, it sounds like Billup was pretty okay with this, honestly.
He was, yes.
Right?
He had plenty of money. He had royal connections. And during the war, Billup even led a militia called Billup's Militia of Staten Island. They need to work on that name, but yeah. He apparently was also quite hot-headed and capable of lashing out in a rage, including to those who worked for him here at this house. But history would also be made at this house. On September 11th, 1776, at the very beginning of the war, Christopher Billup hosted an informal peace conference between British Admiral Lord Richard Howe and 3 leaders from the Continental Congress, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge. This extraordinary meeting would become known as the Staten Island Peace Conference. They talked around the fireplace for 3 hours, and then they moved into the dining room where they feasted on lamb and drank claret.
Back when peace talks included lamb and claret.
That's right.
Claret.
Unfortunately, mutton came of it. Too late to leave, lock the doors.
Ouch.
No, neither side gave in. During the war, Hessian soldiers also lived there with Colonel Billup in the house, and he kept it fully staffed, including a young woman who helped in the kitchen and with cleaning, and who was rumored to be secretly pro-American. According to the story, she was secretly conspiring with the Americans. The main cook at the house was suspicious because she had overheard the girl singing to herself while she was doing her cleaning, songs that were considered rebellious, songs about liberty.
Oh, join hand in hand, brave Americans all, and rouse your bold hearts at fair liberty's call.
When the cook confronted her about her singing, she vehemently denied that she was a part of any plot. But of course, she was part of a plot. A plot to help the American rebels capture her boss when the Hessian soldiers were away and he was alone at the house. When the coast was clear, she was to send a signal to the Americans waiting across the water in New Jersey, simply by placing a lantern in her 3rd floor window. The rebels would know to come at once. And so late at night, in June of 1779, the brave young woman unlatched the front door, tiptoed up to her 3rd floor bedroom, and placed a lantern in her window and waited. She watched in the dark and soon could just make out a rowboat approaching by moonlight. Her heart raced as she saw the soldiers sneak up the shore through the gardens and surround the house. She heard the latch lift on the front door and then loud boots fall on the staircase, which unleashed a chaotic scramble as the Americans captured and hauled off Colonel Billup. He wasn't held for long, but while he was detained, he heard rumors that it was a servant girl who had betrayed him. Upon his release, as he re-entered his room, he rushed straight up the stairs to the 3rd floor and pounded his way into her room. She struggled to get loose, but he overpowered her. Their shouts and yells could be heard out in the garden and down by the water. In a rage, he threw her down the stairs to her death. She would be buried there in an unmarked grave, and her tragic story would soon be overshadowed by the war and completely forgotten.
No tyrannous acts shall suppress your just claim, or stain with dishonor America's name.
And so then, after the war in 1783, when the British evacuated the area, did the Billups stick around the house?
The house was confiscated by the state, and the Billups moved to Canada. and the old manor house fell into disrepair and soon became a boarding house. It was the residents in the 1850s who first reported hearing the noises. Sometimes at night, muffled arguments and thumps could be heard up on the third floor. These noises would move across the floor, pounding their way down the staircase. Subsequent owners were frightened by the same screams and bumps, and nobody stayed for long. By the 1890s, the house was completely boarded up and abandoned. But that didn't mean it was quiet. Neighbors passing by the stone house reported hearing loud shouts, as if someone or something was arguing inside. And children playing in the yard reported seeing something spooky lights up in the house.
However, I'm assuming the story must have a happy ending because, present day, it's a lovely museum today.
Yes, it is. And that's because in 1926, for the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Conference House Association was formed to save and renovate this forgotten house. Workmen undertook the daunting task of fixing up the place, but even they heard sounds and pounding from up on the third floor. Now, they had never heard any of these stories before, so they went up to investigate, thinking somebody was up there. But of course, nobody was there. They shrugged it off, and the house has been operated ever since as the Conference House Museum. On the walls today, you'll find historic portraits, including Benjamin Franklin looking down over the dining room. Lots of period furniture. The second floor, there's the family bedrooms, although that staircase to the third floor has been sealed off.
So, did these noises stop, though, when the museum opened? Was this, what happened?
No, they continued. And the ghosts even took shape and started appearing to some of the people working there. In the 1960s and 70s, paranormal investigators visited the conference house multiple times to investigate. Several museum employees told them that they'd actually seen the ghost of the servant girl in the house. Others had seen a strong man racing up the stairs.
Now, I don't know if anyone of you have been there. I've been there a few times, and actually I'm always transported back to 1776. It's an incredible place, and it is a little spooky, I must say.
When I visited on a chilly, gray October afternoon, I pushed open the large wooden door, found myself in the entrance parlor at the bottom of the big staircase. I got chills walking around the second floor and by that staircase to the third. But what makes this story a little bit different for me is that I also spoke to people there who had actually experienced something ghostly in the house. I met a former caretaker of the house, a woman named Lee, and for a while she lived on site in the caretaker's quarters that had been converted from the old kitchen, and she told me about some encounters that she had had. One evening, she was preparing dinner, bustling around the kitchen, when she suddenly felt a hand on her shoulder. It was heavy, resting on her shoulder. She said, "You know when a friend puts their hand on your shoulder? It was that." She turned around to see who was there, and of course, she was all alone. Now, her husband, who was a teacher, who is not one to give much credence to ghost stories, had been visited by the same hand.
So is this like somebody offering to help? Like, what's going on here? Who is this?
I'll leave that to you. But there was another story that she told me. One fall afternoon several years ago, she was alone and cleaning in the dining room. She was making her way around the room when she suddenly heard the sound of a woman singing.
In freedom we're born.
It surprised her because the house had been perfectly silent. She realized that the voice was coming from outside, just next to the dining room in the yard. So she opened up the front door and she stepped out, but the singing stopped and there was nobody there. But then the singing started up again, but this time just around the corner of the house.
And like sons of the brave, we'll never surrender.
So she followed it around the corner, but as she turned, the music stopped again. So she stood there in silence when suddenly the singing started up again, this time from around the next corner. So she quickly approached that corner, but then she stopped and tried to focus on what was being sung. It was pretty music, but unfamiliar. What was this woman singing? Something about...
But swear to defend her.
And then the music stopped, and all was silent.
So did she ever figure out who or what was doing the singing here?
She had an idea, and it didn't stop her from working there. In fact, she didn't seem to mind it at all. And there's another detail to the story that I should probably tell you. As the house sat abandoned and boarded up in the late 19th century, neighborhood children claimed to see things way up high on the house. At the darkest hours of the night, they said, a small light could often be seen flickering in the third-floor window. A light, a signal from beyond. It seemed that somebody's spirit refused to be silenced. And perhaps that's why it doesn't really bother those working there today. Because in this space that has seen so much history and sadness and bravery, a spirit still sings at the conference house.
And scorn to survive if unable to save.
Lisa Carlin, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, interesting historical footnote. The song that Lisa was just singing is called the Liberty Song. It was a pro-British anthem that in 1768 was rewritten secretly with pro-American lyrics.
Oh, so with our little patriotic songstress here, would you say that the conference house is brat?
I literally don't know what you're talking about, Greg.
Okay.
But you're making me hungry for bitterballin'.
They are still too hot.
Okay.
We'll come and get them later. For the next story here, unfortunately, Annie, the sun is still not coming out for this one. But we are not straying.
Tomorrow.
Hey.
Maybe. Yeah. We're not going to be straying that far from the colonial era, but we will be straying far from the conference house. Our destination is Upper Manhattan, to the neighborhood of Washington Heights, to one of the very heights associated with George Washington. In fact, I'm referring to the Morris-Jumel mansion.
What an audience. And what a house. What a historic house. I mean, one of the oldest in the city.
Yeah, it's actually the oldest standing house in Manhattan, built in 1765, and pretty rare in a metropolis of brownstones and skyscrapers, and so naturally it's haunted. I mean, like, look at it. It's like so haunted.
A bit ominous, but still lovely, Greg.
Don't let its charm fool you, Tom. For the name of this story is Who's Holding the Pitchfork?
Yikes.
Yes.
So take us back to 1765 when this historic home was built up here in, what, bucolic countryside?
Right, captivating views, perfect for a family home, or at least Roger Morris thought so. Now, Morris was a former British Army officer, a loyalist, much like the Billups from the prior story. Morris's lavish home took about 5 years to complete, and then he and his family moved in around the year 1770. However, New York, of course, was all aboil with protests from anti-British rebels. They didn't feel comfortable, so Morris and his family fled to England by the time America declared its independence in July of 1776.
And then what happened to the house? It just sat there empty?
Not quite, actually, because George Washington came along and turned it into a headquarters for several weeks as his Continental Army retaliated against British forces in November of 1776 during the Battle of Fort Washington. Eventually, of course, then when Washington and his men, when they fled the island, the house was quickly reoccupied by his enemies.
By British troops?
And actually, more specifically, by Hessian troops. Now, these are German mercenaries that were hired to fight the war, in the war by the British. It served as a hospital, in fact, during the war, and it was at this time that many Hessians died here within the Morris house, succumbing to horrifying war injuries within these rooms. Now, after the war, the house was largely abandoned, but I mean, it's so beautiful, it was, bound for another purpose. And so in 1810, it was purchased by a French wine merchant named Stephen Jumel, who brought along his rather unconventional spouse, an enterprising woman named Eliza Jumel.
Eliza Jumel, one of the most captivating characters in 19th century New York history. But why do you call her unconventional?
Well, Eliza had a bit of an unorthodox past. She was born into poverty in Rhode Island. As a girl, she grew up in a brothel, and rumors swirled, later on that she had, as a young woman, worked at the brothel as well. Even so, Stephen and Eliza attempted to enter the elite circles of New York society, as they were back then, and the couple would soon become fabulously rich over the years. And then, in 1832, came the rather mysterious death of Stephen Jumel, leaving Eliza not just a widow, but one of the richest women in the United States.
I'm sorry. What do you mean mysterious death?
Some say he died of pneumonia, but other reports claim something a bit more diabolical, that Stephen died by apparently falling upon a pitchfork while in the barn.
He fell upon a pitchfork? How does that even happen?
Well, Eliza, cared for his injuries afterwards, but her enemies, of which she had many, later claimed that she was an incompetent nurse, or even worse, that she loosened his bandages on purpose, and that Stephen bled to death. But I'm on her side. I have another theory that absolves Eliza, although it does not exactly make this an easier story to tell, because both Stephen and Eliza Jumel believed that something else was lurking within the walls of their mansion. In fact, when the Jumels bought the house, believe it or not, Eliza had a $2,000 knocked off the total price due to the stories that she heard about this place. Both Stephen and Eliza would be stirred in the middle of the night by the sounds of crying and wailing in the hallway upstairs. And then after her husband's death, Eliza herself reported seeing more horrible things. The sight of a dead Hessian soldier walking down the winding stairs, moaning and holding his side in horrible pain. So, if Stephen Jumel did die during this freak accident in the barn, it may not have been at the hands of Eliza Jumel, but of something else.
So then Eliza Jumel, who was also very, very, very wealthy,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
was living alone in this possibly haunted mansion.
Right, but not for long, because the home of a wealthy widow is very, very popular, especially for poor opportunists, like the one that's about to enter the story, because Eliza married, at that time, after her husband's death, she remarried, and one of America's biggest connivers, the 77-year-old former vice president, Aaron Burr.
And he's the damn fool that shot him. That is Alexander Hamilton, yeah. 28 years before he married Eliza Jumel, and in the meantime, he had, been indicted for treason. He had tried to set up his own country. So yeah, by now he was a little bit weird.
Yes, and completely broke. When Eliza found out that Burr was using her wealth to pay off his debts, she divorced him after only about 4 months. And then in 1836, in fact, on the day the divorce was finalized, Aaron Burr died alone in a Staten Island boarding house.
Which is tragic. So does that mean that it's the ghost of Aaron Burr that's haunting the Morris-Jumel mansion?
No, because there is no way that Eliza was letting him back through the door, even after death, okay? But it does seem that Eliza is a very firm and discerning homeowner, even after she passed away in 1865, for she has joined the spirits of the Hessians in her own hallway to this day. As the house passed from owner to owner over the years, stories of supernatural phenomena begin to collect. Sounds upon the stairway at first, cries in the night, significant objects suddenly disappearing without a trace, furniture and carpets, even paintings. In 1889, a French photographer named Augustin Leprince lived in the house. The following year, he filmed a very, very early moving picture in the house, one of the very first films ever made in the United States, and only a year after Thomas Edison would debut his first motion picture. Now, what was it that Leprince filmed here? What was captured by his camera? We will never know, because both Leprince and the film disappeared in 1890, and to this day, no trace has ever been found. More supernatural experiences were naturally observed following the purchase of the house by the city of New York, when it was converted into a museum in 1907. Now, there suddenly were hundreds of people, visitors, pouring into that old entranceway here. But one needn't linger long in that entranceway to find Ms. Jumel. One day in 1964, a group of New York school children were playing on the grounds of the Morris-Jumel mansion, laughing and screaming. Suddenly, a woman in a dark green dress appeared on the porch, and she scolded the children in a most harsh and malevolent way.
Hush up. My husband is very ill. You must be quiet.
She was so terrifying that the children stood stone cold in fright and then watched the woman return into the house. Now, a few minutes later, a tour guide appeared and then, properly led all of the children inside. One of the children asked the tour guide, "Who was that woman in green?" She didn't know. There were no costume performers planned for that particular day. And yet, when the woman walked into the entranceway and the children followed her, they all saw their woman in green, a painting of the regal Mrs. Jumel, hanging in the hallway, wearing that very same green dress. And she's still there today. Although she's often not seen, but actually heard. The voice of an old woman is often heard from various rooms, and most frequently around an old grandfather clock. On occasion, she offers a bit of wisdom from beyond the grave, but mostly, she only scolds.
Stay back. Get out of this room.
It's almost like Eliza Jumel has become a docent in her own historic home.
Tom, however, but if you roam the halls of the mansion today, and actually I invite you all to go visit this place. It's extraordinary. And if you're lucky enough to encounter Ms. Jumel, or at least her voice, consider that your lucky day, in fact, because it may be Eliza who is keeping something more sinister and more evil from approaching you. According to the New York Times in 1981, the director of the museum recounted several ghostly experiences. Quote, "On occasion, I will see a very unusual phenomenon with 4 or 5-year-old kids," she said. "They'll refuse to walk down the hallway to this back room. They'll say, 'No, I can't go in that hall. Bad things happen down there.'" More recently, attention has turned to a painting on the ground floor where a ghostly spirit has been seen peering from a painted face, its own evil eyes replacing those upon the canvas. And on the ground floor, in the very room in which Eliza and Aaron Burr got married, the pianoforte is frequently heard playing, although nobody is in there, and in fact the instrument is no longer functional. But who could this be? It wasn't Eliza. And a German mercenary? They wouldn't be playing a piano, would they? Some believe it's George Washington who has returned to his old headquarters. Others that somehow Aaron Burr has managed to reinsert himself into the household. Now, obviously we'll never know. Or in the words of paranormal investigator Vincent Carbone, quote, "People come here and they say, 'George, is that you? Eliza, is that you?' And meanwhile, you've got 100 other ghosts in the room saying, 'Hey, what about me?'" I can only speak of my own experiences when I was there a couple weekends ago, and by myself upstairs. I loved it. But, however, while I was walking from room to room, I did hear some footsteps behind me from time to time, although nobody was there. And I did hear the scraping of metal upon the old wooden floors. This heavy device dragging along the floorboards. Was it the sound of a pitchfork in the hands of a soul forever trapped within the Morris-Jumel mansion?
Wow.
We'll never know.
We don't know. Well, moving from pitchforks to pitch perfect, ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Carlin.
In my eyes, indisposed, in disguises no one knows, hides the face, lies the snake, and the sun in my disgrace. Boiling heat, summer stench, 'neath the black, the sky looks dead. Call my name through the cream, and I'll hear you scream again. Black hole sun, won't you come and wash away the rain? Black hole sun, won't you come, won't you come, won't you come? Stuttering, cold and damp, steal the warm wind, tired friend. Times are gone for honest men, sometimes far too long for snakes. In my shoes, walk in sleep, in my youth I pray to keep heaven send hell away. No one sings like you anymore. Black hole sun, won't you come and wash away the rain? Black hole sun, won't you come, won't you come? Black hole sun, won't you come and wash away the rain? Black hole sun, you come? Won't you come? Black hole sun, won't you come? Oh, in my head, drown my fear till you all just disappear. Black hole sun, won't you come and wash away the rain? Black hole sun, won't you come? Won't you come? Black hole sun, won't you come and wash away the rain? Black hole sun, won't you come? Won't you come? Black hole sun, black hole sun, won't you come? Black hole sun, black hole sun, won't you come? Won't you come?
Lisa Garland, ladies and gentlemen.
The delightful Lisa Carlin and Andrew Austin.
Tom,
Yes, Lisa.
is the bitter ballin' ready? We've been waiting for the whole
Oh.
show. I'd really like some bitter ballin'.
That's a sore subject, Lisa. They were not in the dressing room.
What?
Yeah, someone or something took our bitterballin. Was it any of you? Annie, did you take them?
She's been sitting right there the whole time,
okay,
Greg.
sorry.
We'll get to the bottom of this, and in the meantime, for our next story, why don't we hop on the number 6 and go up to 42nd Street, where we will push through Grand Central and up those Vanderbilt Avenue exits staircase, outside where we can tuck into a little place where we can throw back a cocktail like it's 1924. It's a cocktail bar that can transport you back to a more glamorous era, full of otherworldly customers. Because for many years here, those drinks were a little bit heavy on the spirits. Thank you. For this is the tale of the haunted highballs at the Campbell Apartments.
Yes, the Campbell apartment, or should I say the Campbell, I guess is what they call it today. It's like such an amazing place. Looks very swelligant, right? It has that like speakeasy quality to it.
Yeah, I think it's because it feels kind of hidden, right? I mean, there you are in the middle of one of the city's busiest places, and yet inside, it feels almost like a church or like a, I don't know, Italian palazzo or something.
Or a nightclub. I mean, they even had a velvet rope and bouncer. Does anyone remember that? They had a dress code.
Yeah, everything feels like it's 1924.
Except the prices, drink prices, but
It's New York.
Is it haunted?
Well, since the bar opened as the Campbell Apartment in 1999, there have been many documented cases of ghostly encounters. Many of the waitstaff and, some of the patrons have witnessed phantom customers who, judging from their apparel, seem to be visiting from a century ago. Some feel like they haven't even left the space in 100 years. Although recent changes at the Campbell have upset things a little bit, and it seems like those changes have not gone unnoticed by these ghostly visitors.
Wow. Well, before we get into all of that, why don't we situate the story here? So, was this bar originally part of Grand Central?
No. Now, today's Grand Central Terminal is built upon the site of its predecessors, Grand Central Depot and Grand Central Station. The terminal was completed in 1913, but at that time, this space was just an empty office. Meanwhile, at the same time, a successful businessman named John Campbell was running his firm, the Credit Clearing House, down at Park Avenue South and 30th. He was flourishing, both professionally and personally. In 1920, well, he was flourishing because soon he had been invited onto the board of directors of the Grand Central Railroad and even become friends with William K. Vanderbilt II, who was the great-grandson of the Commodore, who had, of course, built Grand Central in the 1870s. So by 1920, as the stock market rallied, John Campbell turned 40 years old, and he found love. Her name was Rosalind D. Casanave, though everybody called her Princess. They were married the next year in 1921.
Sweet mystery of life, at last I found you.
Exactly. Now, John W. Campbell was the kind of guy who liked to show off a bit, and he wanted an office that really made a statement, even if it seemed over the top. So around 1923, he used his railroad and Vanderbilt connections to secure the lease on this vacant office space in the southwest corner of the terminal. It was a 3,500 square foot room with 20-foot ceilings.
I'm sorry, this enormous office space was going to be for a single person. Where did he put the rest of the company?
Oh, they were in a WeWork by Penn Station.
Oh, yeah, so for the fruit water, I guess.
Right, it's very good, actually, yeah. No, they had offices elsewhere in the terminal, but nobody would have a more luxurious or opulent office than John W. Campbell. The New York Times described it as, quote, an eclectic room of medieval, Romanesque, and Renaissance styling, a brilliantly painted beam ceiling, a baronial fireplace mantel and chimney, and complementary furnishings with leaded glass windows facing Vanderbilt Avenue. He installed a Persian rug collection. He bought an art collection worth $1 million, some of which he kept locked up in his mahogany curio cabinets that lined the room. And for music, he brought in a baby grand piano and a pipe organ. Oh, and he was waited on by a tuxedoed butler named Stackhouse.
Stackhouse. Is this a real person? Is this real?
It's Greg, it's all in the papers.
Okay.
It's all in the papers.
Stackhouse.
So it must be true. As Mrs. Campbell, Princess, later told the New York Times, my husband was a born showman. He loved that office.
I mean, who wouldn't? But to be clear, like, they never lived here. It's an office.
No, John and Princess had their own apartment at Park Avenue and 47th Street. Although they hosted a lot of parties here. You see, John and Princess had a fabulous social life, and this office was clearly made for throwing parties. There, in the height of Prohibition, they regularly packed in 50 or 60 of their friends as big band orchestras performed in front of the fireplace or up in the balcony with the music wafting down upon the crowd.
The moon belongs to everyone. The best things in life are free. The stars belong to everyone. They gleam there for you and me.
The parties continued for years. Imagine, it's the spring of 1929, and the room is packed with New Yorkers in black tie and gowns. There, walking through the crowd with Princess, is John Campbell, his signature old-fashioned in hand. And all about them, guests are laughing, some dance, and the room is loud with jazz and the sound of champagne corks popping. Everybody, it seems, is unaware that the party is about to end.
The flowers in spring, the robins that sing, the sunbeams that shine, they're yours, they're mine.
John Campbell continued to run the company through the Great Depression, and then he sold it in the 1940s. But he kept this office for himself with Stackhouse until the 1950s. By then, of course, the city was changing. Even right around his office, train ridership plummeted as the city lost jobs and commuters. Rail executives around town were talking about demolishing both Penn Station and Grand Central. Even so, John Campbell still showed up where, insulated here in his office, it could still be the Roaring '20s. In 1957, John W. Campbell died, and his office doors were locked.
So what happened to all of his stuff that was in there, like the art and the furniture, the Persian rug collection, for instance?
Well, it's strange, really. Most of it just disappeared. All the furniture, gone. That $300,000 Persian rug, vanished. The space sat vacant for a while before Grand Central handed it over to the Metro North Police Department, who used it as a booking station for accused criminals. They even kept their guns locked up in his old curio cabinet.
Okay.
And then the 70s and 80s happened in New York, and things got dingier and dingier, so that by 1994, the New York Times reported, quote, "Now the office is a maze of dropped ceilings, air-handling ducts, and fluorescent lights." The fluorescents are killers.
Yeah.
The spirit had been dramatically and rudely altered.
But fortunately, as you know, some of you may remember this, there was this huge renovation of Grand Central in the 1990s. It was incredible.
Yeah, that's right. And a restaurant impresario named Mark Rossich had an ambitious plan to transform this now dumpy office space into a spectacular bar that would pay homage to John W. Campbell's office. So Grossich spent $2 million returning it to its 1920s splendor. Painters spent months restoring the ceilings. They brought in period furniture, and Mark Grossich established that dress code.
And then, of course, he was the one that named it the Campbell apartment, which, conjured up this image of John Campbell living there.
Right, but nobody ever lived there.
Yeah, okay.
Although, it seems that many of those old party guests from the 1920s decided to come back and linger. Patrons and many members of the waitstaff and bartenders, even Mark Grossich himself, reported experiencing a range of ghostly encounters while visiting or working at the Campbell apartment. Many waiters told him that they felt pushes on their backs and sometimes a tap on their shoulder as they made their way across the main floor, only to turn around and find nobody there. But what was there was a sudden gust of cold air. The waiter said that it was like invisible guests in the middle of the room were stopping them for drinks, but when they turned around, no one was there, and they simply got used to it. Other waiters working late at night or when closing up reported faintly hearing the pipe organ play rather strange, discordant music, as if fingers were falling on multiple keys at the same time. But that pipe organ hadn't worked for decades. And these visits happened to patrons as well. On busy nights at the bar, patrons reported giving their orders to a tall waiter in a tuxedo who would never return with their drinks. They complained. Now, Mark Grossich had his waiters dressed nicely, but nobody wore a tuxedo. But Stackhouse did.
So all of these ghostly encounters were reported to Grossich, I assume.
That's right.
But was he afraid to get the word out about these?
No, he was actually surprisingly honest and public about it. In an interview with Eater.com, Mark Grossich was asked directly if his bar was haunted. His response, yes. I feel very strongly that the space is haunted. We have some otherworldly visitors. But the thing is, nothing bad has really happened yet. If there are ghosts at the Campbell apartment, they are very fashionable and friendly ghosts. There were so many paranormal encounters that in 2011, a team from EPIC, the Eastern Paranormal Investigation Center,
we know them,
visited the bar and took readings. They shot video. They found especially high levels of activity up in the upper areas around the balcony and the bathrooms. Now, the bathroom. Mark Rossich told Town and Country magazine in 2015 about an incident that occurred in the ladies' bathroom line upstairs one evening. An elegantly dressed female patron had been standing and waiting in line. When it was her turn, she walked inside and locked the door. The next woman in line waited patiently, and others joined behind her. And they waited, and they waited. About 15 minutes went by, and they started to get concerned. So they knocked on the door, but there was no response. They tried the door, and it was locked. Nobody was responding. There was no way to get inside because it was locked from the inside. So at that late hour, the bar called a locksmith to come and break into the bathroom. When they opened up the door, they found that small room completely empty and freezingly cold. As for the balcony, well, a few years ago, a waitress was cleaning up as the bar was closing late one night, and she looked up in the balcony and she saw an elderly couple sitting at a table, all alone having drinks. Where had they come from? She noticed that they were dressed for the theater. He was in black tie and she was in a gown. They were enjoying some drinks. He was whispering into her ear. The waitress motioned that she be right up. As she climbed the staircase up to the balcony, she felt a chill in the air, a gust of cold air going down her back. As she stepped out to the balcony, she found that she was completely alone. She approached their empty table and looked around. There was no sign that anybody had been there. No sign except an old fashioned that was still cold.
Wow, do we think this was maybe John and Princess?
Or there are hundreds of guests? There are many possibilities, or there were many possibilities, because in 2016, Grand Central decided that they wanted to replace the Campbell apartment with something trendier. Mark Rossich lost his lease, and a new owner stepped in and decided to make it brighter and fresher. They also renamed it simply the Campbell, and they ditched the old dress code. Unsurprisingly, the reports of ghosts have dried up as well. Maybe they no longer felt comfortable there, right? Maybe it was no longer their scene. A portal to the 1920s had been closed to them. Maybe that is exactly what Grand Central wanted. But it doesn't mean that they're no longer out there. So as you enjoy your nights out in New York City, keep an open mind, especially if you're enjoying an evening in a place with music and theatrics, and a certain 1920s nostalgia to it. Because there, you might just find yourself sitting with John and Princess.
And love can come to everyone. The best things in life are free.
I just want to give a shout out to all of those who are watching on the live stream right now. Theoretically, millions of people are watching.
Millions?
Theoretically. But
This is
I know
huge.
my sisters are watching from the in the Ozarks, so hi. And my mom, sorry. You also. All of the whole family. Next, we're taking a cab ride up from Grand Central Terminal and heading to the address 1 East 62nd Street, right next to Central Park. Now, Tom, are you familiar with the TV show The Gilded Age?
I've heard of it. You know, they have a podcast too.
Yes. Well, the events of that show primarily take place in two lavish homes on East 61st Street. So one block down from the subject of our tale, East 62nd Street.
This is a key historical slide
Yes.
for the evening, yes.
Freeze it to your memory. Anyway, so my story today also involves ambitious socialites. And one woman in particular who became so attached to her Fifth Avenue address that it seems she has refused to move out. The name of this story, Tom, is The Portrait of Mrs. Spencer.
What do we know about Mrs. Spencer, Greg, or about the house?
Well, let's start with the house, actually. It was built in 1903 for the extremely wealthy John R. Drexel, son of Anthony Drexel of Drexel University fame and a business partner of J.P. Morgan. So it was like a real upper crust, really fancy space here. A 40-room house with a private ballroom on the top floor and a beautiful library on the ground floor. The interiors were rich in ornate French paneling and decorative detail, all the better to impress and entice those ravenous elites of high society.
Including Mrs. Astor herself, whom by this point had moved up to 65th Street, so just 3 blocks away, 65th and 5th. And as listeners of HBO's official Gilded Age podcast will know, on the show, the Drexels are always invited to Bertha Russell's parties.
Well, John and his family eventually moved away, and by the 1930s, like so many townhouses during this period, the mansion was partitioned off into smaller apartments for rent. And during this boarding house period, it played host to one very notable resident in 1959, Ernest Hemingway, who lived on the second floor. And though this would actually be his final New York residence, for he would die just 2 years later in Ketchum, Idaho.
So is this the story of Ernest Hemingway's ghost?
Well, with apologies to the literature lovers out there, no, or else I would have titled this story A Farewell to Arms.
And we're off. Yeah. Okay.
However, I would like to introduce another pop culture icon to the story, a legendary entertainer of stage and television. So this is the story about how she was haunted by a ghost when she moved into the top 3 floors at 1 East 62nd Street in 1988. Ladies and gentlemen, I now introduce you to Joan Rivers.
Can we talk?
Can we talk?
Can we talk, Tom?
We're talking.
We are talking.
Yeah. Yeah, seriously. We love Joan Rivers, right? She was one of New York's greatest entertainers, a legendary stage comic, who made her way into the Greenwich Village comedy scene in the 1960s, which was so male-dominated.
So some of you may know her from The Johnny Carson Show or her own talk show. Perhaps you are a fan of The Muppets Take Manhattan or Spaceballs. In fact, it was a year after the release of Spaceballs that when she decided to buy the upper 3 floors of the building at 1 East 62nd Street. So I like to think, in my mind, that she used her Spaceballs paycheck to buy the building.
Joan Rivers as Dot Matrix in Spaceballs.
Anyway, she had just moved back to New York from LA, and she really wanted to pour all of her resources into somewhere that she could really feel comfortable. But when she first saw the building, she described it as, quote, a rundown maze of cloakrooms, maids' rooms, and musicians' changing rooms with vast spaces of no use whatsoever. It had been on the market for 2.5 years without a single bid, and by now, the plaster was falling off the walls. There was this terrible water damage everywhere. Yet she knew about those old lavish French interiors, back in the years with the Drexel family. And so she wanted to return it to that original glory.
Oh, in other words, Joan wanted to give it a facelift. That is a Joan Rivers joke, okay? That's like straight from Joan, folks.
Yeah.
It's homage.
Well, she would eventually create an extremely luxurious and palatial home for herself with beautiful crystal chandeliers, antique columns, marble columns. This place had gilded walls, triumphant staircase. You could just imagine Joan Rivers strolling down the staircase here to greet visitors. She herself described it as Louis XIV meets Fred and Ginger.
Which sounds marvelous, but where are the spooks?
Well, outside of her little Yorkie named Spike, I doubt that Joan was expecting to have a roommate, and yet she found herself with one, and one who would put on a very different kind of Tonight Show. Now,
It's my favorite joke in the whole show.
Now, very early on, before anything had been done, Joan had declared that her new apartment felt wrong, that it was filled with an unnerving energy. That didn't stop the work, of course. I mean, in this beautiful ballroom, the workmen began clearing away decades of paint and wallpaper. And at some point, the workers began experiencing odd little mishaps and incidents of an unexplained character. Things moving around, going missing. Well, one very hot August evening, Joan decided to check in on the renovation work. So she comes in one night with her little dog, Spike the Yorkie. She gets off the elevator and she goes into the apartment and she decides to enter the ballroom. But the dog refuses to move. Spike passed through the doorway, but then the dog froze. Joan didn't know what was happening, so then she steps into the room and experiences an unnerving chill, a freezing cold, even though, as I said, it was a hot August evening. There were no lights, just those from cars passing on the street outside, but she managed to make out what just looked like a bit of hastily written graffiti on the wall. It seemed to fade in and out. I mean, naturally, this disturbed her, and so she mentioned these strange events in passing to the elevator operator, who just nodded and said to her, "Oh, I guess Mrs. Spencer is back."
Who's Mrs. Spencer?
Well, Mrs. Spencer is the name that they have given the spirit that lives at 1 East 62nd Street. According to building lore, Mrs. Spencer was the niece of J.P. Morgan, Drexel's business partner. But there's so many Spencers in the Morgan clan, I couldn't really figure out which niece this actually was. Anyway, the spirit has been experienced within the building for decades and had long ago been stuck with this nickname Mrs. Spencer, perhaps by a former resident who began calling her that, and then the name just, stuck.
And does Mrs. Spencer only hang out in Joan's apartment or wander throughout the whole building?
No, she's been seen all over the place in many apartments, which leads one to believe that she may have lived here when it was like a complete family abode, for she has a certain freedom to go between floors. Joan Rivers reported one of her neighbors had an ornate chandelier that was decorated with baby cherubs that were holding these light bulbs. So one evening when the neighbors returned home, they discovered that the cherub heads had been torn off and then thrown upon the floor. Another neighbor had witnessed two people in fine evening dress, like they were going to a costume party of some kind, like a turn-of-the-century soiree. The neighbor noticed this couple marching down the steps with not a care in the world, like not paying attention to anything. And then suddenly they just vanished. This was Mrs. Spencer, but with who?
Did Joan do anything about this? Or did she just resign herself to living with ghosts?
Did she? Howard Stern show. She actually did, not surprisingly, attempt contact. Some kind of expert familiar with supernatural matters. And in typical Joan Rivers fashion, it was somebody rather flamboyant, a New Orleans spiritualist named Sally Ann Glassman, who performed a ritual in the ballroom which involved, in her own words, quote, a banishing sword and a lot of screaming at the top of her lungs. The ritual seems to have had some effect, but slowly over time, Mrs. Spencer would again make her presence known here in Joan Rivers' apartment. Perhaps it would have eventually driven Joan out of the apartment entirely, if not for something strange that she found in the basement of the building, just a few months after Joan's date with the spiritualist. She was going through some boxes when she had an urge to inspect some broken drywall. Now, as she moved closer, she could see that there was a space behind that drywall. She pulled it back a little bit, and she saw something. There was a painting there, a framed oil painting of an unidentified woman. Joan, of course, completely and absolutely believed that this was the one and only Mrs. Spencer. And thinking that it might appease her spirit, Joan asked for the building to be hung in the building's lobby. She then determined that fighting the spirit would be a lost cause. Nobody knew why the woman was haunting the house at 1 East 62nd Street, and it seemed unlikely that anyone would ever find out. So Joan Rivers just decided to make her feel at home. From that moment on, Joan had beautiful fresh flowers displayed in the ballroom at all times, even when she wasn't at home. And she kept up this tradition for the rest of her life. Now, it doesn't seem that Mrs. Spencer ever left the house at 1 East 62nd Street, but at least Joan was finally at peace with her. Joan would entertain millions for the rest of her life until her own untimely death in 2014. And even then, on that final day, you could still find a beautiful bouquet of flowers in the ballroom. That bit of brightness that Joan made sure to bring to this mysterious and misunderstood ghost at 1 East 62nd Street.
We love Joan so much. We are so sorry that we don't have her wits with us today to help deal with everything. Can you imagine Joan Rivers on TikTok?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Missed opportunity. Well, for our final story, we want to go back to that trip to Europe that we mentioned earlier, a voyage in which we trace the roots of New York City history from the Netherlands.
Yes, 400 years ago in 1624, Dutch settlers arrived here in what we now call New York Harbor to set up New Netherland and New Amsterdam.
We even explored that whole story in a 4-part miniseries. Has anyone listen to the miniseries? Yes?
Oh,
All right, cool. Because we had a great time filming, recording it. The memories are still incredible. Like the windmills were wonderful. Loved the canals. Of course, the bicycles.
The bitterballen.
The bitterballen, yes.
Those are my hands pointing to bitterballen, which is as close as we're going to get to bitterballen today because somebody took them.
Yes. Did someone at the public take them? Did Lin-Manuel Miranda take our bitterballen?
The plot thickens.
Well, let's turn away from Amsterdam bar food to feast on a tale of old Amsterdam, by which I mean New Amsterdam, which is old.
Yes, correct. One man whose story we really tapped into and explored in that miniseries was the last Director General of New Amsterdam. We're speaking about the one and only Peter Stuyvesant.
Peter, or Petrus, as he called himself, is at the center of one of New York City's most famous ghost stories. A story that's so powerful that the first time we told it here on this stage, back in 2018, we managed to awaken his spirit. Let's say.
But the thing is, now we understand him so much better, having done all that additional work. So tonight, if you'll indulge us, we'd like to go back and re-explore that ghost story, but kind of set things straight, right?
Yes.
So without further ado, then we present the final story for this evening.
The Ghosts of the New Amsterdam.
Our destination for this final spooky tale is St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, the oldest standing structure in the East Village. Under that handsome stone church lies a burial vault where the body of Peter Stuyvesant has been interred for centuries.
Peter Stuyvesant became the Director General of New Amsterdam in 1647, and with his religious conviction and bracing demeanor, he managed to clean up that little outpost, although he made few friends in doing so.
He also had a wooden leg, which earned him the nickname Silver Nails for the band of silver that wrapped around it. And he walked with a cane, which he occasionally used to straighten somebody out. Now, in 1664, 17 years after he took control of the settlement, the English sailed in and took New Amsterdam away from the Dutch. Most of the people living here were okay-ish with that. Everybody, except Peter Stuyvesant, who was prepared to fight off the invading English army himself, but was finally convinced to surrender.
Peter would eventually retreat to his farm estate, the Great Bowery, which more or less comprised much of the land just to the east of us, so the East Village. He was a very spirited old man, snapping his hickory cane onto the backs of those who displeased him, up until the day he died in 1672.
But, you know, in the case of Peter Stuyvesant, as they say, you can't keep a good man down. Or apparently in his vault, either. For almost, from the moment that he was buried just over there, it seems that his restless spirit has made quite a habit of wandering around his old estates.
From a 1966 book of New York legends, quote, his body had been put into a closed vault, but that did not stop the ghost of the governor from stomping around on black or moonlit nights in his old haunts. Folks heard him stomping his peg leg and ran away in fear. That pleased him, in particular if they were English.
The first recorded appearance of the ghost of Peter Stuyvesant was in 1774, more than 100 years after his death. That year, the old Stuyvesant mansion, which was located up around today's Stuyvesant town, burned to the ground. Bystanders who were fighting the blaze witnessed a hazy figure hobbling through the cinders. It was unmistakably Peter Stuyvesant.
He was seen a second time in 1799 when the old Stuyvesant Chapel was replaced with a more ornate church, the present-day St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. Disturbing sounds, that of thumping against a stone floor, were heard from the first moment the church opened its doors.
Had someone or something been upset by the change? The city was rapidly growing, and soon the old Stuyvesant farm estate was chopped up into city blocks, all except for one little street in front of St. Mark's Church.
The city's development, covering all of Stuyvesant's former farms, seems to have enraged his spirit to such an extent that his apparition soon appeared in several spots surrounding the church, scaring the workmen away.
And that alone could explain why Stuyvesant Street, in front of St. Mark's Church, remained untouched. It is the only surviving street from the old farm estate, and one of the only streets in Manhattan that lies truly east to west.
Well, one fateful evening in the 1820s, a young sexton dared enter the church late at night to fetch some documents for the rector. He pushed open the heavy doors to the church, holding his lantern aloft as he hustled down the center aisle, quickly grabbing the papers and immediately heading back for the door.
Outside the church, however, waiting for him near the large oak tree, the sexton could make out a man standing in the shadows. "Can I help you, sir?" he said. "Has there been any trouble?"
Suddenly, this mysterious figure stirred. He lifted a cane and wailed, plunging at the sexton, the sound of a wooden leg scraping against the rocky ground. The sexton screamed for help, dropped the papers, and ran to the gate in absolute horror. He turned back to see the man emerge from the shadows, a man dressed in an old Dutch waistcoat, his eyes red with fury.
Passers-by in their carriages along 2nd Avenue observed the sexton as he raced from the churchyard. Then they saw him, this strange gentleman in the churchyard, stomping into the church and slamming the door behind him.
And then the church bell rang, and it rang so furiously, so loudly, that certainly the bell itself would smash into pieces. Neighbors jumped from their beds and ran to St. Mark's to see what was going on.
A group of men raced inside and toward the belfry to find the culprits. But when they got there, they discovered The bell was ringing by itself. They climbed to the top of the bell tower to see if they could silence it, but found that it was impossible because the bell and the swinging rope were both burning hot. Hotter even than bitterballin'.
The bell rang and rang for hours and into the morning. Nobody got any sleep that night. Only when daylight broke did the sexton finally dare re-enter the church to visit the burial vault of Peter Stuyvesant.
Inside, the sexton found the body of Peter Stuyvesant, undisturbed from his eternal sleep. But in his hand, he was clutching the section of a rope, its end singed by fire. It was the rope belonging to the bell of St. Mark's in the Bowery.
Today, in the burial ground, you'll find a bust of Peter Stuyvesant, which has been in the churchyard for more than 100 years. And it's very near the spot where Stuyvesant's apparition was seen nearly 200 years ago.
As for Stuyvesant's burial vault, that door has been cemented closed. They say to prevent vandals from getting into the vault. Or could it be to prevent something inside from coming back out?
Now, thankfully, it seems that Stuyvesant has not been felt or seen in many years. After all, the Bowery is the original border of his property, and maybe Peter just prefers to stay over there, perhaps amused that his former estate has now become the thriving East Village. So, tonight, I hope we have set the record straight about this supposed ghost, and we hope that the spirit of Peter Stuyvesant is forever at peace.
The end.
Yeah.
So thank you. Oh, come on, you've got to be kidding me.
Are they moving sets upstairs? Like, what's going on?
I am Peter Stuyvesant, and I have come for the BB, for the BB.
The BB, Greg, he's come for the Bowery Boys.
Peter, you can't hate us. We're not Quakers.
Not you, you fools. The bitterballin'. I have come for the bitterballin'. I haven't had a good bitterballin' in 350 years.
You took the bitter ball and, hey, be careful, you gotta blow on him first.
Yeah.
Oh my God, flaming hot. Hot, I burned my mouth. Nope.
Well, I guess we'll never see Peter Stuyvesant on Hot Ones, eh?
Silence! Get off this stage. And as for the rest of you mere mortals, have a great New York week. Whether you live here or not.
Thank you.
There's a somebody I'm longing to see. I hope that he turns out to be someone to watch over me. I'm just an average gal with an average life. I work from 9 to 5. Hey, hell, I pay the price. All I want is to be left alone in my average home. But why do I always feel like I'm in the twilight zone? I always feel like somebody's watching me, and I got no privacy. Whoa, I always feel like somebody's watching me. Tell me, is it just a dream? When I come home at night, I lock the door real tight. People call me on the phone, I'm trying to avoid. Or do the people on the TV see me, or am I just paranoid? then I'm in the shower. I'm afraid to wash my hair, 'cause I might open my eyes and find someone standing there. People say I'm crazy. Just a little touch. Well, maybe showers remind me think I'm too much. I always feel like somebody's watching me, and I got no privacy. Whoa, I always feel like somebody's watching me. Can you tell me trick or treat? Ladies and gentlemen, the Bowery Boys.
We want to thank Lisa Carlin.
And Andrew Austin on the piano, ladies and gentlemen.
Up in the loft, Craker Daglian, the master of visuals.
Huge thanks to Tyler and Keenan up there, plus the bartenders and the servers. Did you see their outfits? I mean, come on.
And finally, we want to thank all of you, not only for coming out tonight, but for listening to our podcast and helping us create this extraordinary thing that allows us to perform on Joe Papp's stage here in the Public Theater. We are just so honored to do that.
Thank you.
So thank you all very much. And I have one final message. Vote.
Who's watching? Is Peter Stuyvesant watching me?
Who's watching?
Maybe Jumel is watching me.
Who's watching?
John Campbell and Princess are watching me.
Who's watching?
Oh my God, Bat Damon is watching me. I always feel like somebody's watching me. New Yorkers ain't got no privacy.
Oh.
I always feel like somebody's watching me. Kenny, is it just a dream? I always feel like somebody's watching me. Who's watching? Who's watching? Who's watching? I always feel like somebody's watching me.
Wow, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Happy Halloween, everybody. Get home safe.